Hello, and Christ is in our midst. Today I'd like to talk to you about the saint that we celebrate on the fourth Sunday of Lent, St. John Climacus, St. John of the Ladder, which is what Climacus means in Greek. It may sound like a strange name, St. John of the Ladder, but he gets that name because he wrote a very famous book called The Ladder of Divine Ascent. It was a very influential book. John now was the abbot of a monastery in St. Catherine's Monastery in Sinai, in the desert, in Egypt. And it's a very ancient monastery. He had wanted to learn about the monastic life, the inner life, and he spent a long time learning from others, not just in person, but also reading books about the spiritual life. And he was then asked, when he became the abbot of the monastery, he was asked to write down the things that he'd learned for the benefit of others. And so he wrote this book called The Ladder of Divine Ascent. And he imagined the spiritual life as a ladder. Here you have an icon of a ladder of 30 steps, because Jesus was 30 years old when Jesus began preaching and appearing in public. And so he used that image of a ladder of 30 steps to talk about how to lead a serious inner life. And he meant it initially for monks, but many others started to read it. Nuns, lay people who lived in the world, not out of the world, in a monastery. Well, this icon shows monks trying to go up the ladder, some making it to the top, and others falling off, because the leading a spiritual life, as I said, a serious inner life, making an effort, can be difficult. And there are a lot of stumbling blocks along the way that St. John talks about in his book. Now, I'll read you just a very little bit from the very first step in his book. Before that, I just want to let you know what I think are three things that you could, I wanted you to be aware of this book. First of all, the importance, the value of books to help us think about and to reflect on how to lead a spiritual life. Books are valuable. The second thing is the value of the experience of others. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. That many people have gone before us, saints have gone before us, like St. John, and St. John too gained from those who had gone before him, and he put what they had said down in a book to make it accessible, easy for others to understand. So the value of the experience of others. And finally, which is really the main theme in this little book of St. John's, is the value of making an effort. If you want to lead a serious spiritual life, an inner life, it takes effort. It's an athlete, it takes effort to train, sets aside a lot of other things that they might like to do because they're focused on their sport. A soldier is focused on training to learn how to conduct their job in the military. They have to set aside other pursuits. And so the spiritual life is the same way, that it takes a focus. And that's the purpose of Great Lent, and it's the aim of this little book. So let me give you a taste from the very first of those 30 steps that St. John talks about. He says, the Christian is one who imitates Christ in thought, word, and deed, as far as is possible for human beings. So that's the most basic, simple aim of the Christian, is to look at Jesus and decide, this is how I want to behave. And then he goes on to say, some people living carelessly in the world have asked me, we have wives and are beset with social cares, and how can we lead the solitary life? All right, in other words, people who had normal families and children were listening to St. John, reading his book, reading his words elsewhere, and wondering, what is it we have to do? We're not monks, we're not nuns. What do we have to do to lead a spiritual life? Is it possible? And this is what he says. Do all the good you can. Do not speak evil of anyone. Do not steal from anyone. Do not lie to anyone. Do not be arrogant towards anyone. In other words, looking down, very prideful, looking down on others as if you're better than they are. Do not hate anyone. Be sure to go to church. Be compassionate to the needy. Do not offend anyone. Do not wreck another man's domestic happiness. And be content with what your own wives can give you. In other words, be content with the family life that you have, and don't be complaining all the time. If you behave in this way, you will not be far from the kingdom of heaven. Let us charge into the good fight with joy and love, without being afraid of our enemies. Well, the enemies are spiritual enemies. They're not individual people. It's the things that make it hard for us to lead a disciplined inner life. Things like our anger, our greed, our passions, our pride, all those things that fight against us. And that's why it takes effort to stay focused on Christ and doing his will. And then, especially good for us to hear, offer to Christ the labors of your youth, and in your old age you will rejoice in the wealth of dispassion. What is gathered in youth nourishes and comforts those who are tired out in old age. In other words, if you begin now when you're young to lead a serious spiritual life, to think about God, to practice self-discipline, to think about how you can imitate Christ in thought, word, and deed. If you start that practice now, then when it'll become second nature to you as you grow older, and it'll be something that you can draw on and will give you great joy and love and satisfaction and peace. So let's all together agree that we're going to, for the rest of Great Lent, make a new effort. Maybe we're only going to be on the first step and not the 30th, but let's make a new effort to put into practice some of these kinds of things that St. John talks about to grow in that inner life in Christ. Christ is in our midst.